All right, so I've never done the first presentation at a conference before, so I'm very happy about that. So what I'm actually going to be talking about today is how we as educators can actually use the emerging science of the brain to improve recycling wherever we are. So at Planet Ark, we try to use this science in all of the work that we do, and I'll give some examples from some of our campaigns about how we do that. But I encourage you to think about if you're at a council, if you're at a waste contractor, if you are another not-for-profit or community organisation, how you can be using this emerging brain science to make our work much more effective. I'll be using a couple of examples, like I said, from our work. I'll also be using a couple of examples from councils. If you see your work up here and don't want to admit to it, that's okay. So, hands up anyone who's ever worked in an office where the office kitchen is left in a mess. Yep. Hands up anyone who's seen a sign that reads something like this in their office. Hands up if you're the person who wrote the sign. Oh, come on, there's going to be more of you. Okay, so part of what I'll be talking about today is how this sign can be effective or how it's not necessarily effective. And I'll be, like I said, talking about the emerging brain science to kind of discuss that. So, I'm going to take you off on a little journey to the United States first, before I get on to the kitchen signage. The Petrified Forest is a national park in the United States, in, I think, Arizona. And it's actually a forest from about 400 million years ago, and the wood has opalized, essentially. So the national park is literally covered in this beautiful opal, which is the wood that has been petrified. And a social researcher was in this petrified forest and was wandering through. And as you would expect, if you've got beautiful opalized stones on the ground, some people were taking some of those opalized stones, and there were some signs up that the park rangers had put up and said, which were encouraging people not to take the opalized wood. And this social researcher kind of looked at the sign and thought, I wonder if there's other ways that could be worded to make it either more effective or less. So essentially what he did is he set up an experiment. So he looked at the existing signage, which is the stuff the rangers had put up there, which read, many past visitors have removed the petrified wood from the park, changing the natural state of the petrified forest. So that was a sign that was there. He reworked it. Please don't remove the petrified wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state of the petrified forest. So the wording's not that dissimilar, but a little bit different. And then since he was actually a social scientist, what he actually did is set up another area of the park that was a control. So it had no signage at all. And what they actually did is they put little white dots underneath the stones so they could actually see how many of them were stolen, so they could actually measure the real impact of this signage. And this is the impact of the signage. The area with no signage at all had a 2.9% theft rate. So 2.9% of each of the stones that were marked were stolen. The area with his signage in it had a 1.6% theft rate. So about half, which is really good, actually. You'd expect that's, you'd be happy with that. The original signage had a 7.9% theft rate. So it encouraged people to steal the rocks, okay? And what I didn't tell you about the social scientist when he was wandering through there, the reason he actually decided to do this research is because he was there with his girlfriend. She saw the sign, she picked up a rock and put it in a bag. And he said, what'd you do that for? And she said, well, everybody else is doing it. I may as well do it. So what that sign had done, it had reinforced the idea of social proof. It had reinforced, if you don't quite know what to do when you're somewhere, what we actually do, and we don't really like to admit it, but what we actually do is we follow the behaviour of other people around us. And in this case, the behaviour indicated by this signage was to take the stones, to take the rocks. So when we're thinking about our waste education, we need to think about this brain science. If our waste education is reinforcing that other people are doing bad things all the time, we will do bad things because we see that as the social norm, as a social proof. Another example of this research by the same social scientist is hotel towels. So again, hands up anyone who's been in a hotel bathroom which says, please reuse the towels for the sake of the environment. So they're very common. He decided to test which message works really well on that, or which works and which doesn't. So he came up with 4 options, and then they tested them in a whole bunch of hotels. They made sure the people in the rooms were fairly similar, so only single people in the room, not couples, same types of room, blah, blah, blah. So pretty robust science. And he tested 4 messages. So partner with us to help the environment, which is pretty much consistent with the stuff that you mostly see in a hotel room. Help the hotel save money. Not the strongest message, but 75% of guests who stay in this room reuse their towels, and almost 75% of guests reuse their towels. So they are the 4 messages he tested. That's the order in which they came, so not surprisingly. Helping the hotel save money was not a great motivator for behaviour change, and about 16% of people in those rooms reused their towel. Help us partner for the sake of the environment. Almost double the number of people reused their towel. So changing the wording from one to another helped in that case, almost double. 75% of people, 75% of guests reuse their towel, got up to about 44% reuse rate, which is actually pretty good. And that goes back to what I was talking about before, the social proof. So what they're saying there is that most people are reusing their towel, so I should probably reuse my towel because it's the right thing to do. And interestingly, when you say almost the same thing, except 75% of guests who stay in this room reuse the towel, you get another 5% of people reusing it. And what this is about, that increase, is essentially about the fact that the original 75% is people are kind of like me. They're staying in this hotel, they're people like me, I'll reuse that. The people who stay in this room are even more like me. They're people who stay exactly here. So what we actually try to do is mirror people around us who are more like us. The more like us someone is, the more like them we will behave. So in this case, that's why we get to about 50% reuse rate in those hotels. So when we at Planet Ark are running our campaigns, we have this kind of stuff in mind all of the time. So we look at ways to reinforce the social proof that people are recycling. So in this case, we tell people all the time how many cartridges are recycled through the Cartridges for Planet Ark program, not because we want to brag about the number, although it is a good number, but we do it because what that does is reinforces the fact that everybody else is doing it. 34 million cartridges, it's the thing to do. If you're not recycling your cartridges, you're not part of the social proof. And then we also, in this case, one of the cartridge manufacturers, Canon, we give them resources that say Canon customers are doing this. So this is the equivalent of the 75% of people in this room. So 75% of Canon customers recycle their cartridges. So by showing that people like them are doing it, they're more likely to do it themselves. Similarly, we do it with our PR and media as well. So in this case, what we do for the Cartridges program is we try to find examples as much as possible of local communities doing the recycling. So Hornsby Shire Council appears to be the #1 recycler for cartridges almost every year. Not really sure why, but they actually do really well. So when we put out media releases, we make sure we're talking about people in Hornsby, because that reinforces that people like me, i.e. people who live in Hornsby, are doing the right thing. It's not groundbreaking stuff, but it's actually really important and powerful stuff. And the photo there I have of the children. So about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, we decided to push the Cartridges program much more strongly in schools. So what we did as part of that is we did a photo competition for schools to get as many photos of school kids recycling their cartridges as possible, so that when we went out to communicate with them, we had images of schools and school kids recycling as a way of social proof. So reflecting the people we want to engage in the campaign. And similarly for our business recycling website, we use case studies all the time, and that's for exactly the same thing. We want small businesses to be reflected in the communication that we have. So it's fine for us to put out a guide that doesn't have a small business in there. If we want a small business to get involved, we really want them to see themselves in the education processes. This is a council who I'm not going to reveal who it is, And admittedly, this isn't an education resource. This is some research that they've done. It's on their website, however. The two things, it's not very good quality, so what I've actually done is typed out the two things in red are the things I want you to focus on. So 9 out of 10 people observed disposing of cigarette butts littered them. So if we're talking about social proof, if we're talking about the way we want people to behave in terms of recycling, telling them that 9 out of 10 people choose to throw their butts on the ground actually reinforces that that's the right thing to do. It's what society does. And similarly, 50% of people observed chose to litter, a broad range of age and cultural backgrounds. So essentially what we're saying there is it doesn't matter what age or social background you're from, littering is the right thing to do, or it's the social norm, not right, it's the social norm thing to do. So, like I said, admittedly, this isn't community education, but it's on their website. If you're interested in littering, you look it up, and what you see is everyone else is doing it, so why should I not? It's not always easy to decide whether something is supporting a positive social norm or a negative social norm, and I'll give you a couple of examples of where it might be questionable, and I don't have a strong view on these either way. This is from a council, a really good campaign, I think, about nappies in waste, in the recycling bin, but what they're actually saying there is, in the past 8 years, recycling contamination has increased from 4 to 14%. I'm not saying necessarily that's reinforcing the social norm, but what that actually is doing is reinforcing that something has changed for the worst, it's getting worse. You know, that might or might not be reinforcing the social proof, I'm not sure. But my point is, when you're developing an education campaign, then you should be looking at it through this filter. Will this actually do that? Similarly, this is a project that was run in the city of Sydney about cigarette butts. They collected a whole bunch of cigarette butts and then put them into this artwork which said yuck. But what it's showing is there are literally millions of cigarette butts there. Okay? Is that reinforcing the social proof of littering? It's arguable. And this is the United States campaign, which is don't trash facts, although they are trashing facts in the United States. 38% of highway litter is cigarette butts. So is that reinforcing that dumping cigarette butts is the right thing to do or not? So it's worth thinking about those things. On to another form of brain science, the way we can think about stuff. So this is some research that was done about asking people whether they would accept the researchers putting a 6x3 billboard in everyone's front yard which says drive safely. So they went around to houses and said, can we erect this drive safely billboard in your yard? Not surprisingly, only 17% of people said, yes, you can build a billboard in our front yard. So not a very big number. But what they did is they went to another group of houses, and instead of asking them to build a billboard, they gave them a small sticker to put in their front window, about that big, which said, drive safely, drive carefully. And then they went back in 2 weeks and they asked, can we now build a billboard in your front yard? And 76% of people said, yes, you can build a billboard in our front yard. Okay? And what's happening there in terms of the brain science is we like to be consistent. We like to be seen as the person who stands by something. So if I've got a sticker in my window which says, drive safely, and then somebody asks me to put a bigger thing that says drive safely, well, I have a psychological need to be seen as consistent, so I'll say yes to that poster, even though I don't really want a 6x3 foot poster in my front yard. So essentially, the benefit that we get in using this brain science is if you start small, you can get people to do much bigger things later on. And again, that's not necessarily groundbreaking, but it's worth thinking about whenever we're developing education, and that's essentially what we do as well. So we have programs like the Friday File Fling, which is a small workplace activity. Really all it's about is getting your files and putting them in a recycling bin. But if we can get a workplace to engage in an activity like that, they're also much more likely to get a waste contractor for their bigger stuff as well. And that other image there is from our recent business recycling campaign, where we're trying to get businesses, small to medium businesses, to deal with their waste much more effectively. Well, we give them a cartridge box that's free or a mobile muster box that's free, so that they start to see themselves as the kind of organisation that recycles, and then you can get them to do bigger things as well. And the last area that I'm going to be touching on is essentially the power of sight. Something above 50% of all the activity in our brain is dedicated to sight. It's dedicated to receiving, understanding and processing sight. So when we look at the education resources that we produce, we should really be thinking sight first over reading or any other. I'm not going to play this video, but I really strongly encourage you to Google the McGurk effect, the BBC, check that out and have a look. Sight is so powerful in the human brain that it overpowers both hearing and taste. So what this effect really is about is if somebody looks like they're saying a letter, regardless of whether they're saying that letter or not, we will hear that letter. Okay? I really encourage you to check that out. So sight is more powerful than sound. And I love this experiment. Sight is also more powerful than taste. So this is an experiment that happened a few years ago in the United States, in France, where in the area of Bordeaux in France, they have a university course on wine tasting. Okay? And what they did an experiment for 53 of the graduates from the wine university in Bordeaux, a red wine university, and asked them to describe the flavour of the wine. Right? And what they actually did is they used white wine with red food dye in it. Okay? And when they asked them to describe the flavour, so this is the flavour that they would describe a white wine on, this is the flavour they described the white wine with red food colouring on. So when you add food colouring to white wine, people can't tell the difference. We take our cues for food, from flavour, from the visual effect of it. So when we're talking about which are the most powerful senses for us to be using to encourage people to do the right thing, we should be looking at sight as one of the primary ways that we deal with that education. This is a fantastic study, I love it. Similarly, in a further study, this one was a research where a group was given information, they were given it orally and then tested on it 72 hours later. When they were given it orally, they remembered 10% of the information. When they were given it orally with pictures in support, they remembered 65% of the information. So if you want people to remember your information, make sure you're making it visual. Add photos and images to it as well. And this is another research where they got 3,600 people, put eye scanners on them and showed them 1,400 print ads. And what they were tracking with the eye tracker was where they looked on the page. And regardless of how small, how crowded, and what poor quality the photo was, they looked at the photo first and remembered the photo. So if you want people to remember your education, then you need to use as many images as possible. And how well do we at Planet Ark do with that? Not that good always, I have to admit. But then neither do some councils. So this is the waste education PDF from a significant council. Not much better than ours. If you're a consumer, you sit and look at that. If we go back to that, you're not going to remember very much of it because visual trumps words, both verbal and written. So if we want our education to be effective, we need to include as many photos as possible. And I have to say, in most of our campaigns, unlike the Recycling Near You website that I just showed you, we actually do that at Planet Ark all of the time. We use as many photos as possible. We use photos of people, of faces, of the boxes in terms of the cartridges. We want people to remember what the box looks like, so we show the box as much as possible. And about 3 years ago, we started a program called More Pictures, Less Words. So essentially what we did with that, every single person in the organisation went through a training as part of our staff meeting where we identified all of the elements of the organisation where we could put photos that didn't currently exist. And then we check that up regularly. So if you look at our newsletters from 3 years ago to our newsletters now, there are photos everywhere because of this process. And this has been one of the most effective processes we've had in terms of bringing images into the work that we do. These are two references I would encourage you to check out. So most of the studies I talk about are from that book, Yes, and the stuff on visual imagery is in the book Brain Science. So, Brain Rules. So I encourage you to check those out. And that's it from me.